Like many families who have been stuck at home during this COVID season without any sport, in my family we resorted to watching some of MasterChef. If you've watched MasterChef, you will know this, but one of the favourite challenges that I enjoy is when contestants undertake to identify while being blindfolded. I knew there had to be a reason why I had my mask with me. When I see that challenge, it kind of engages me because I start to think that's something that I could do. You know, I watch them cook and their skill levels are far beyond anything I could contemplate. The way they prepare and think, you know, that's completely out of my zone. But eating food, I think I'm pretty good at that. How about you? Have you ever thought about what it would be like to eat when you can't see? How would it be to identify food just from kind of the taste or the texture? You ever wondered that? You know how we hear that story about if someone has one of their senses removed, one of the 5 senses, that the others are heightened? So if you can't see, that all of a sudden your hearing kind of improves in some way. You know, a little while ago I was chatting with Lindley Scott, who was telling me that when he had been in Malaysia with his wife Wendy, they went to a restaurant called Dining in the Dark. As you can guess from the name, you eat completely in the dark. You have to be guided by the staff with kind of night vision goggles to your chair and table. Your senses, your visual senses are completely cut off. You cannot see, and so you cannot begin to put your brain into gear to imagine what the food tastes like. The restaurant describes itself this way. It's the very first of its kind in Malaysia. Challenging yet fulfilling, packed with different insights and new perspectives. Amazing, bizarre, cool, dark, extraordinary. Come and experience it yourself. That's got kind of advertising speak written all over it, doesn't it? And it goes on to say that the surprise elements plated by Dining in the Dark make it an ideal spot for a romantic dinner in KL. If you're looking for a romantic restaurant that gives you and your loved one a unique dining experience, well, I think it would bring new meaning to the idea of a blind date. I'm not sure if I would recommend it for a first date, but you know, I think you get the kind of the gist. Can you imagine being in that restaurant? Can you imagine kind of the things that are going through your head, the fear, the uncertainty, the kind of the question marks as you started to kind of raise food into your mouth about what this is going to taste like? I recently read the menu. I'm not sure how you're meant to read it in the dark, but this is what it says on their sample menu. The first course is a pre-dinner aperitif and some games. Interesting start. It's followed by an appetizer where it says that you begin your journey with 4 contrasting tastes and sensations. And then that's followed by soup, and it's not just ordinary soup, it's a duet of flavours. The main course? Well, the main course is described as trio, inspired by tradition. 3 works of art that are worth seeing. I'm not sure how you can see them. Maybe you have to see them in your mind's eye. And of course, finally, the dessert. And for all those of you who are sweet tooth, you know that's what the restaurant is all about, is dessert. Well, this dessert is described as finale, a symphony of 5 different creations dedicated to all sweet endings. You know, when I read that menu, that just sounds to me like a whole lot of words, and I'm asking, where is the steak? But what is it like to not be able to see? What is it like to not be able to put into kind of visual terms what you imagine in your head? In Mark 8:23, it tells us that Jesus took a blind man by the hand, led him out of the village. Then spitting on the man's eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything now?" "Yes," he said, "I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around." Here's this man. The text doesn't tell us if he's been blind all of his life. It's probably pretty easy to presuppose that that was the case. But when he's healed, he describes people like trees. Maybe in his mind's eyes, as people had told him things throughout his life, that was what he kind of imagined trees to look like, and he'd put people in a different category. And so now he starts to be able to see again, and his mind's trying to process them together. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, how we might see without seeing what's described to us. How do you imagine the colour of the sea without seeing? Because we rely on sight, of course, for far more than just visual images, don't we? We see more than just information. In fact, we process many things through our sight. You think about these different areas of life. When we see danger approach, a bear, a crocodile, we sense fear. If we can't see, how do we understand fear in that same way? Our eyes help us to process what then our emotions take on board. Oh, what about beauty? I mean, I can give you a detailed description of the Grand Canyon. But until you journey to Arizona and sit on the edge of the Grand Canyon, maybe dangle your feet over the sides and gaze out across the Colorado River and the way in which it's wrought itself through the landscape there, you can't imagine it the same without your eyes. That beauty is processed through what we see. It's the same way with the colour of the Great Barrier Reef. Without our eyes, we can't quite imagine it, can we? Or what about love? To look into the eyes of the one you love. To stare at a newborn child. You see, with our eyes, we help to process some of those feelings and thoughts that are part of our life. How do you process them without sight? It's hard to imagine how that is possible. But it's so important because how we see the world is partly determined by how we see through our eyes. Imagine what it was like for this blind man, never being able to see. But now the scales are removed from his eyes and all of a sudden his life is open to a new world. Whereas once he was helpless, now he can find his way around town. Whereas once he was dependent on others, maybe now he can get a job, belong in a family, be welcomed back into society. Because for him, seeing was about far more than just physically seeing. It was about him being a part of the entire world, about him being engaged and involved and understanding the world. You see, once he was blind, but now he can see. Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were opened. His sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. He could see everything clearly. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being blind and now being able to see?
Dear friends at Croydon Hills Baptist Church, I just want to take this opportunity to give you an update on the Ministry of Mission Aviation Fellowship and just to share some things that have changed with the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. I get asked that question a bit, how has this pandemic impacted the Ministry of MAF? And I just thought I'd just touch base on a few of those things. Firstly, we've had a significant reduction in operations. MAF is very anxious to not be a vector of transmission of disease, and so we've really made sure that our mobilisation into the remotest parts of the world is done safely and securely in a way that won't impact the lives in a negative way of people who live in isolated places. Secondly, a lot of the countries that we are working in and living in have limited restrictions, and they've got states of emergency restrictions similar to what you're having in Victoria, where people cannot mobilise around without specific needs or specific responsibilities, and so we've significantly cut back our operations. But despite that, most of the staff are still living in the countries where they're serving, and in fact 85% of our staff are still in programs. And so we're supporting those families as best we can remotely. Logistics is difficult. We've got families who are in different parts of the world, spouses who are separated because of the travel restrictions, and conducting maintenance. All those things become challenges at this time. Also, the priorities have changed. MAF seeks to serve the church and support remote communities in the places where we work, and that work has particularly been a priority around response to COVID-19. We've been supporting the government and health agencies with distribution of testing kits around the country. We've been moving patients and healthcare workers, and we've had to modify our aircraft to separate the pilot and the cockpit from the main cabin in the small aircraft that we operate. I just want to finish by saying thank you to you all at Croydon Hills for your support of the work of Mission Aviation Fellowship, and to remind you that you are partnering in God's work around the world. We also want to send you greetings. Sue, my wife Sue, and I want to send you greetings from Cairns, and just to let you know we're thinking of you and we're praying for you as you yourselves live in very difficult times at the moment with the stage 4 restrictions. We realise that's difficult, and we're praying that it's a time, although difficult, a time of growth for each one of you. God bless, and thank you for your support. Bye-bye.
Let's continue reading from verse 27. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he said to them, "Who do people say I am?" Well, they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets." Then he said to them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah."
Immediately after the story of the blind man, Mark tells us another story. It's another story of a blind person who now can see. In fact, this is the journey that we've been going along all through the Gospel of Mark as he's recorded it. Who is this man? Can you see who Jesus is? And through life-changing moments, through healings, through feedings and calmings of seas and forgiving of sin, the disciples have been asking this question: who is this man? Can we see who this person is? And you know, for what seems like months and months and months along this journey, the disciples had been failing to see the signs, failing to pick up the clues that Jesus had shown them. They hadn't been able to fully grasp the significance of what Jesus had done in the middle of them. In fact, earlier in chapter 8, when they arrived, a number of Pharisees had confronted the disciples and Jesus because they didn't believe who he was. And they were asking him for some sort of miracle to try to prove himself. They have hard hearts. They can't see who Jesus is. It's the same problem with the disciples. Mark records it this way in verse 17 of chapter 8. He says, "Don't you know or understand even yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in?" That's what Jesus is saying to them. You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? It's almost like Jesus is filled with despair. It's right in front of you, but you're wearing this mask that is blocking you off from seeing the truth. As Jesus asked the blind man, "Do you see?" he might as well look at the disciples and the Pharisees, and he might as well look at us and say, "Do you see? Do you understand?" And so in this passage we read about how Jesus and his disciples left the Galilee region and they're up in their villages near Caesarea Philippi, and as they're walking along he asks them this question: "Who do people say that I am?" This is Jesus saying, can you see? Can you see what's right in front of you? Who is this man? All along, as I said, we've been hearing about people who can see with their eyes but can't see with their heart, who listen but they don't really hear. Let me ask you a question here. Why do you think that Peter and his colleagues were blind? Why do you think they were unable to see who Jesus was? I think it's because Peter had a basic misconception about who the Messiah would be. Remember, right at the start, we talked about Jesus being called the Messiah, the King, the one who would redeem and save his people. In his mind, a Messiah was meant to be a man who was filled with power, a person who had authority, who could raise up a kind of an armed forces amongst the Israelite community, defeat the Romans, restore the temple to full glory in Israel. But instead, Jesus seems to do the opposite. And this conception that he has, this misconception that he has about who the Messiah will be, prevents him from seeing who Jesus is. His lack of faith in being able to understand, in fact, that Jesus was different than what he expected. He wanted some form of kind of selfishness. I want to sit at the right hand of power. But instead, Jesus comes in humility and service. It's like Peter has a massive blindfold over his eyes that prevent him seeing who Jesus is. And all through this gospel, we've been hearing about people who cannot see because they have something blinding them. And I want to say to you today that Peter's not alone in that experience. In fact, for so many of us, we have things that blind us from being able to see who Jesus is. So let me ask you, is there something that blocks you from truly seeing who Jesus is? Maybe for some of us we have misconceptions like Peter does. We have this idea or this expectation about who God should be, the ultimate fixer. There should be no pain in the world because God should be in control. And so when we see or experience suffering in this world, it says to us, well, there can be no God. And we can't see who Jesus is because of this misconception. Or maybe some of us, we have a misconception about the nature of Jesus' followers. I mean, why aren't those people who call themselves Christians better? I mean, they're hypocrites. If they truly believe in this stuff, if they truly believe in this message of love, they wouldn't make mistakes. They would be better in our world. And I can't believe in Jesus when I look at what the followers of Jesus are like. And we have this misconception about his followers that blinds us, or a different expectation about what God is like that prevents us from seeing. For some of us, it's not a misconception, it's a preconception. For some of us, I imagine, are like this. I can't believe that Jesus could be a real figure of history. I can't believe that Jesus could be a real figure of history that's supernatural, that could be the Son of God. And my worldview says that's not possible. We live in an age of science, Andrew, not an age of mythology. There's not fairies that live down the bottom of the garden. I remember having a conversation with one particular 16-year-old young lady, a lovely young lady, very intelligent. Both of her parents were scientists and worked in the academic world. I cannot believe, Andrew, she would tell me, it's against my worldview. It's against how I understand the world, what I've been raised by and live by. I believe in the rational, not the supernatural. You know, I want to say the truth is that Christianity has solid historical, rational, philosophical grounds for belief, and I would invite you to explore them. But as I spoke to this young lady, this preconception that she had of the world blinded her from seeing who Jesus was. And for some of us here today, it's a blind spot that we have. We cannot see. We hold fast to some preconception, some set of views, and we're afraid to challenge ourselves. We're afraid to open our eyes and truly see. Maybe for some of us it's a fear of the unknown. Or maybe it's a pride in the certainty of the position in which we stand, and we think we know what we know, and so we say, no, I cannot open my eyes. I hold fast to this preconception. For some of us, what blinds us is not kind of an intellectual issue. For some of us, an emotional issue. We can't see Jesus because of pain. It's more personal than this rational argument or what the very nature of who Jesus was or God and things like that. No, it's because we've experienced pain in some way. We've been hurt by life, hurt by the world, and it becomes impossible for us to see that Jesus can truly be a God of love. Maybe you've been hurt by another Christian, hurt by the church, and that pain is very real. and it blocks us from seeing. It says we can't believe. And maybe for some of us, we almost know what's needed, but it just seems like it's too difficult. We're almost afraid to believe because that would involve forgiveness or reconciliation or dealing with that pain. And so it's not a preconception or a misconception, but it's our pain which blinds us. We know it would take just an incredible effort to truly believe. It might confront us. It might challenge us to change in some way. It might require humility to listen, to seek answers without claiming to know them in advance. But for some of us, it's our pain that gets in the way. For Peter and his colleagues, it was their misconception about who Jesus would be. They'd seen lots of him, seen his power, seen his authority, seen his compassion, but they still struggled to see. But now we read here that in this time, that the scales that blind them from being able to see who Jesus is are removed. It tells us that they left Galilee and went to Caesarea. Jesus asked them that question, who do people say that I am? And this is how they respond. Well, they say, some people say that you're John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the other prophets. Usually in those days, the questions were asked by the followers of the teacher, the rabbi, to the teacher. But here Jesus flips it on his head, says, can you see who I am? And his followers, they give the easy answer. They've been contemplating this question about who Jesus is for a long time. Early on in the time they had spent with Jesus, they had been there where he had calmed a storm, and they'd asked that question, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? So it's not like they hadn't thought of this question beforehand. And here the crowds had flocked to Jesus, so when he says, who do you say that I am? They say, well, it's easy to give the answer of the crowds. You know how it is, isn't it? It's hard sometimes for us to stand up on our own, but easy to defer to the masses. So they say John, Elijah, or maybe some of the other prophets like Moses or Abraham or David, great figures of Jewish history. But Jesus repeats again, who do you say that I am? And Peter has his blindness removed. And he says, you are the Messiah. You are the one who is King, the one who is Saviour. I don't think he fully comprehended everything by what that means at this stage of his life. Kind of like the blind man able to see more images than picture quality, really sharp. You are the Messiah. And I want to say to you today that that's the same question that Jesus asks each one of us. Who do you say that Jesus is? Who do you say? Can you see? In this I find Jesus so patient. We're often so stubborn, so plagued by fear, almost cowards. At times we have hearts which are just hard, or our ears are kind of blocked, or our eyes can't see. And yet Jesus patiently draws us to himself. Patiently shows us love and grace. In the previous account, the blind man could see because Jesus reached out and he touched his eyes. And now we see here, right now, that Jesus doesn't physically touch his eyes, but he spiritually touches Peter. And he can see. And when Peter's eyes are opened, his world is transformed, because now he can see everything through this new light. As the blind man can see people, would be able to contemplate the beauty of the countryside, be able to look into the eyes of his friends and family. So now as as Peter has the scales removed from his eyes, he can see Jesus, begin to see who Jesus truly is, and his world changes. Because everything becomes processed through this sight of seeing who Jesus is. Love and forgiveness and hope are all processed differently when we can truly see who Jesus is. And I want to say to you today, very simply this, that is my prayer for you as much as it is continually for myself. That we would have the blindness removed from our eyes so that we can see Jesus. Can you imagine what it is like to truly see? Can you imagine the change to how you see the world? Because when we open our eyes and see Jesus, the light shines in and everything is transformed. Can you see? Who do you say Jesus is?